Okay, so we're going to have a look at some of the stylistic elements in the three passages provided for the tall man in the VCAA 2011 literature exam. We'll also touch on some of the themes that Hooper is exploring in these passages. However, of course, you're expected to enhance your knowledge of those themes with the papers you've already read about how she explores white patriarchy and her other concerns in the texts. So, as we know, the genre for The Tall Man is known as literary journalism. So it's not straight journalism. Hooper does intertwine a narrative into this, and she does also intertwine her own personal bias. Now, if we look at the beginning of passage 1, we can see that she deviates from the linear narrative. So normally it is in a linear form, as in, the events are unfolding, particularly the trial. But sometimes she provides anecdotes that give a sense of backstory to what's happening. Now, in this particular story, there are a few things that draw our attention. One, the idea that parents can't raise their children and past the age of 5. And the second being, obviously, this tragic incident of a child being set on fire accidentally by a white man. Now, the fact that she includes and mentions that he is a white man, not just, set on fire by somebody by accident, tries to show a sense of negligence of these people who are looking after these dormitories, generally government-run dormitories. So to show that these children were not in particularly safe hands. Now, the next sort of narrative element that she intertwines is of the 3 boys on the jetty. But if we just go back to that one before, giving this particular anecdote also lends sympathy to the plight of the Indigenous people, and so will the one of the 3 boys on the jetty. Now we notice that there's a strong sense of rebellion amongst these boys. Notice how, they look no more than 13 but said they were 16. Also, we've got this idea of them sort of asking for a smoke even though they're underage or drinking. Now, in a community that has been very oppressed, forms of rebellion can be a way of sort of getting back at authority. So even though we might be inclined to see, young boys drinking beer or smoking as being self-harm, it can be a way of standing up and rebelling against what they believe to be an oppressive authority. Also, the fact that Hooper has positioned this particular anecdote straight after the one of the children in the dormitories could suggest, by the way that she's juxtaposed it, positioned it next to each other, that this sort of, behaviour from these young men is a result of the way that they've been raised, not by Indigenous parents, but in such environments as dormitories. So we see here a sort of sense through the cigarettes of symbolic rebellion. Now, her question here of asking the boy if he could have a ticket to any place in the world, where would he go? And him saying sort of Brisbane, because it had a park with a swimming pool that offered a free feed once a week, it makes it seem like, we garner a sense of sympathy because we see how they're not as well off as perhaps the people who are reading her book. We can see that their needs are sort of very simply met. They're not particularly greedy, or they're not wanting to sort of suck the system dry. And this garners a sense of sympathy for the Indigenous youths. By listing some of the music and bands that these kids like to listen to, Eminem, Usher, Destiny's Child, Michael Jackson, this is all very sort of common pop culture, particularly during the period that this was written. So it makes the Indigenous boys seem not too much different from ourselves because, we share a general sort of pop culture. Now, when we talk about the boys down here being full of spirit, full of life, and it shows they had a dance routine, one shows some punches he'd learned in boxing, so it seems like these boys are emulating what they see. They see dances, they do dances. They see boxing, they do boxing. They see drinking, alcoholism, and smoking, they do that as well. So it shows that they're very young and they're very impressionable. This can actually be a signifier of hope, because given the right kind of environment, these boys could grow up in the right way. Now, she brings, of course, down the tall man legend again, which permeates right through the book. And remember that the tall man is not necessarily the legend itself that we're concerned with, it's what it symbolizes. This notion of, a big, ominous force that's pressing down upon the people and oppressing them. And that's the white patriarchy that you've read about in your texts. Now, passage 2 is actually where we see most of the stylistic elements out of the 3 passages. And sometimes you'll find that. You'll find that one passage out of the 3 will have more sort of, juicy elements for close analysis, where others would be more theme focused. Now, to start off with, we have this dialogue between Chris Hurley and Peter Davis. Now, the selection of this particular dialogue makes Chris Hurley seem a little bit dubious, because look at the wording here, not one sherrick of anger, which is a tiny, tiny bit of anger. You ended up on your own nose in the police station, in your own police station. And every time he's grilled about this, about getting a smack in the chops and things like that, he always responds that it didn't give him any anger at all. Yet, Hurley again juxtaposes this dialogue with her personal observations of Hurley, and she describes him in a very particular way. First of all, let's look at this expression of ashen-faced. Now, ashen-faced, pale with shock, fear, or illness. So we can see that this is really getting to him. But then we've got this description like eyes narrowed. So if you just for a moment sort of narrow your eyes, sort of scrunch them up a little bit, it kind of makes you look very, let's have a look. I'll try and get Google images. Hopefully we won't get anything naughty. Eyes narrowed, images. Okay, this kind of expression, this sort of expression, okay, this sort of expression. So it seems to be one that's calculating. Okay, because it's like they're kind of narrowing their focus. It's calculating, and it can often be sort of quite aggressive as well. So through her choice of adjectives and the way that she describes him, we start to think that there is something rather dark and sinister about him. Staring at his open hands. Now, these open hands could perhaps hold memories of him sort of punching and belting Dumaji. So it's significant that she points out that he's staring at his open hands, perhaps recollecting memories of what he had done. And this notion again of something poisonous inside him. So, and bitter rage as well. So these kind of adjectives really describe someone who's quite calculating and sinister. Hooper adding her personal bias to the text. Now, again, she breaks the linear nature of this recollection by going back to her own personal experience hiking in Cape York. Note all the personal pronouns of I and I've. So she talks about, and she creates this symbol of the 2-metre tall police officer being bitten on the foot by a huge snake, perhaps the rainbow serpent, the totem of the Dumaji's grandmother. Now, there's no proof here that the snake in the cave painting was the rainbow serpent, was the Dumaji's grandmother, but she wants to create this parallel. She wants to create this metaphor. Hurley had told his story as a man would suck venom from a bite. His life was at stake, and this was the only antidote. So here there's not, I guess there's a parallel in the fact that we've got a 2-metre tall police officer, a tall man, Hurley again, and we've got the snake bite, and we've got the parallel between that she's tried to create between the rainbow serpent and this snake in the painting. So even though the painting itself was not directly related to Dumaji necessarily or to Hurley, She's created this parallel to exemplify how he's been affected, or even how the police institution as a whole has been affected by being challenged by the Dumaji family and the incident that has occurred. So this section here is the most rich out of all the passages with regards to symbolism, and is definitely worth noting. Now, I want you to have a look down here where she again starts to speculate with I wondered and I wished. And she has this series of questions, these questions again raising doubts amongst the readers, and these questions that are honestly never answered, which is a little unfair to Hurley because she raises all this speculation, and that's not true journalism. But anyway, do you ever dream you're falling? Now, falling dreams are meant to be an indication of insecurities, instabilities, and anxieties. So by her asking, do you ever dream you're falling, is kind of saying, do you feel unstable now? Do you feel not so much like the big, strong giant now? All these questions here, they're so loaded. They're loaded with accusations that he is living a life of regret and torment because he's responsible for the death of Cameron Dumaji. The trial isn't over yet, but we've got things like, do you still think you were good? Do you ever dream of Cameron Dumaji? So she portrays him to be very villainous even before his guilt or innocence has been declared. Now, if we have a look at this next section down here, we have, again, a few elements of imagery that you could focus on, such as Elizabeth standing in the coat she was sharing with her sister Jane. So again, we have this notion of the inequality or the difficult circumstances for the Indigenous community, the fact that they're sharing a coat. Where have we got? Also, she makes the family sound a little bit sort of humble in the way that they didn't, where is it? I'm just trying to find something. They didn't ask any questions of the lawyers, so they don't seem all that demanding. Now, this can be two things. It could show them to be humble, or it could show that they don't expect much from the legal system because they're well aware that the Indigenous are never given sort of a really fair go in the legal system. Now, it's interesting that she mentions how they didn't bring in Lloyd. We understand, of course, Roy and his, drinking and inconsistencies, but Lloyd, being more copper than blackfella, was not brought in by either the prosecution or the defence, because they don't know where his loyalties would lie, because on the one hand, he's part of that system of oppression, the police force. On the other hand, he's Indigenous. And that's why for them he posed too great a risk. Heading on down the end, it's important that we note, where is it? Wearily Davis said he was sorry, but that was just too big an issue for him to solve. So again, we've got the sense of individual members of the legal system wearily, so he's very, very tired. This has been very difficult for him and a real battle. And he's just an individual up against a huge system which he feels is just too big. So by showing how individuals get easily worn out and defeated by such a huge system of oppression, the reader can begin to see that, something has to change in order for both the Indigenous people who are sharing jackets and members of the legal system to be able to make a difference.